And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to this special edition of the Way to Wow shows. It's Wednesday, February 12th, sorry. Think about that for a second. And today is Abraham Lincoln's birthday. And so, as is my custom, I'm doing a special show to help mark, honor, and celebrate the day. I've mentioned this before, I think, that when I was a child, we had two president holidays. Both were in February. There was Lincoln's birthday and there was Washington's birthday. Washington's birthday, I want to say, is on the 20th. Oh, that's funny. On the 17th, sorry. So, and then sometime in, I think it was the 70s, it was replaced by President's Day. And there's sort of an implication there that all presidents are worth honoring. And I have to say, without getting on too much of a soapbox, clearly that is not the case. There have been good presidents and there have been bad presidents. And so although as citizens of the United States, I think we are obligated to respect the office of the president, that doesn't mean that we have to celebrate the presidencies and lives of every man who's held that office. And indeed, I think that there have been two undeniably great presidents, George Washington, known as the father of our country, and Abraham Lincoln, known as the Great Emancipator. And so you will find that I don't do a President's Day celebration, but I do mark both George Washington and Abraham Lincoln's birthdays. And so as I did on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, I'm going to focus on the early part of Abraham Lincoln's life, to the extent that most people know something about Abraham Lincoln. They know about his time as president and his impact on the American Civil War. Not that that's not important. It certainly is. I'll touch on some highlights in that. But I think that to truly understand the greatness of Abraham Lincoln, we need to know about the formative events and the formative forces in his life. And I think that those give us the best lessons for ourselves and what we may be able to accomplish, and also why Abraham Lincoln is worth honoring. So I'm going to, as I typically do for these types of holidays honoring an individual, I'm going to give a biography of Abraham Lincoln, talk about some of the seminal aspects of his early life, and then I'm going to finish up by reading one of his most moving speeches. Probably his best known speech is the Gettysburg Address. I know when I was in sixth grade, it was still the practice that children memorized great speeches and then had to give them to their classmates without, any paper. You had to do it from your head. I remember memorizing the Gettysburg Address and also the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. I still remember large portions of both. They were, I think, very fine exercises. But I'm actually going to read Lincoln's second inaugural speech, which is perhaps more apt to the times. Many people have likened what's going on in the United States to a civil Cold War. Frankly, some with relish. I shudder at the thought. The Civil War in the United States was tremendously bloody. Hundreds of thousands of Americans were killed and wounded. Families were torn apart. And the Cold War, meaning the post-World War II Cold War, was also very horrific. To put the two of them together is on some level beyond imagining. And I would like to think that we as Americans can move beyond our part, not move beyond our partisanship, but look beyond our partisanship and remember that we are all citizens of this great country, a country that is still seeking to align itself with its principles, as all human endeavor does. Never perfect, always room for improvement, and so. I think Lincoln's second inaugural address is more appropriate. So looking at his biography first. So Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12th, 1809. So what, about 216 years ago, in a log cabin. That is not myth. He was born in a log cabin in Hardin County, now LaRue County in Kentucky. To Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks Lincoln. He moved with his family to Indiana in 1816 and then to Illinois in 1830. Abraham Lincoln grew up in poverty. Now, that wasn't particularly unusual for Americans in the antebellum 19th century. But it was still a formative aspect of Lincoln. So during his youth, he worked on a farm. He worked as a rail splitter. That was someone who chopped trunks of trees into rails that were then built into fences, and in various other odd jobs. At 19 years old, he took a job as a store clerk in New Salem, Illinois. And in so doing, he started to gain experience both in business and in leadership. So in 1932, at the age of 23, Lincoln served in the Black Hawk War for 3 months. He did not see any combat. His duties were included building forts, burying dead soldiers, and protecting settlers. Now, he was a volunteer, and the way things worked at that time was volunteer enlistments lasted for about a month each, right? Because they were volunteers, they weren't getting paid, and so they had other activities to be concerned about: families, farms, etc., businesses. So for his first enlistment, he was elected captain of his volunteer company. And Lincoln said later it was one of the most gratifying moments of his life to be recognized by his fellow volunteers for that leadership position. He re-enlisted twice after that as a private, and he served until the war ended on August 27, 1932. So he had both business and military experience by the time that he was, in his early to mid 20s. Lincoln had very minimal formal education, formal schooling, again, as was not unusual at this time in the United States, but he was a voracious reader. And I emphasize this, that so many of the great men in history who grew up poor were largely self-taught through reading. And that includes Dwight Eisenhower, for example. Now, George Patton didn't grow up poor, but he almost surely was dyslexic. And so he did very poorly in school, and so he ended up in large part educating himself also through being a voracious reader. I think it's in even in today's world where information seems so easy to come by, and we have AI large language models to do so many things for us. It still behooves us to be well read. That is, I would argue that an educated person is a well read person, as opposed to a person who has, for example, graduated high school or college or something like that. Lincoln was self-educated. He learned again through reading books, and he developed a deep interest in the law and politics. He studied law independently and was admitted to the Illinois bar in 1936, after which he established a law practice in Springfield, Illinois. Now, it's interesting to note there were law schools back then, but of course, Lincoln could not afford law school. And even today, although it's extremely unusual, it's my understanding that you don't have to go to law school to qualify to sit for the bar. You could study on your own. And maybe, again, with the development of large language models, AI, and all these kind of things, maybe people will start doing that again. It'll be an interesting thing to see. So William Herndon was Lincoln's best known law partner, lifelong law partner. And Herndon was instrumental in preserving Lincoln's true life story. So after Lincoln's death, Herndon conducted interviews with people who knew Lincoln, family members, childhood friends, colleagues. And in 1889, he wrote Herndon's Lincoln. It was one of the earliest and most detailed biographies of President Lincoln, of Abraham Lincoln. So in 1834, Lincoln was elected to the Illinois state legislature as a member of the Whig Party. So I'm gonna digress and talk about the Whigs for just a minute, and then I'm gonna go back to Lincoln's biography because I think it's important to understand. So the Whig Party was kind of a predecessor to the Republican Party, although it was not a direct transition. So the Whig Party was active from the 1930s to the early 1950s, and it was founded primarily in opposition to Andrew Jackson and the Democratic Party. So the Whigs supported a strong federal government, internal improvements such as roads and canals, and economic modernization. Okay, now what divided the Whig Party was the issue of slavery. So Northern Whigs were abolitionist, and Southern Whigs wanted to maintain the institution of slavery. And the split essentially became irreparable in 1954 with the passing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed slavery to expand into new territories based on the idea of popular sovereignty, meaning that each state should get to decide whether it was going to allow slavery within its borders. So many former Northern Whigs who were opposed to the spread of slavery joined abolitionist Democrats and Free Soilers. Free Soilers were people who wanted slavery abolished, to form the Republican Party in 1954. And this is the I think important idea, which is that unlike the Whig Party, which was not an overtly anti or pro-slavery party, the Republican Party was founded as an anti-slavery party. It sort of brought together all the anti-slavery elements into into one party, really from kind of across the political spectrum. And the Democratic Party became essentially the pro-slavery party, because abolitionist Democrats, generally speaking, moved to the Republican Party. So Abraham Lincoln, who had been a Whig for his political career up until that time, and in fact was the probably the not probably he was the leader of the Whig Party in Illinois, became one of the leading figures in the Republican Party. So Southern Whigs, now with the collapse of the Whig Party, they either joined the Democratic Party or the short-lived what was known as the Know Nothing American Party, which was a very nativist party, meaning it was very sort of America only for natural-born Americans. That party essentially disintegrated. And so the Republican Party did inherit several of the Whig Party's policies, including things like a strong national government and internal improvements. It was primarily an anti-slavery party. That's where it really sort of made its mark. So now going back to Lincoln's biography, he was elected to the Illinois state legislature in 1934 as a Whig. He served 4 terms of 2 years each until 1942. And during his time in the Illinois legislature, he opposed the expansion of slavery, and in fact, even co-signing a protest against pro-slavery resolutions in 1837. So 4 years after leaving the Illinois state legislature, Lincoln was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, also as a member of the Whig Party. He served 1 term in Congress, which was what he had promised the Whig Party in Illinois that he was due. That he promised the Illinois Whig Party he would only serve 1 term. So among his accomplishments as a one-term congressman he was a vocal critic of the Mexican-American War. He supported the Wilmot Proviso, which essentially sought to establish a ban on slavery in any territory that was gained from Mexico. The Wilmot Proviso did not pass, but it did show Lincoln's early opposition to slavery's expansion. He also proposed a plan for gradual emancipation of slaves in Washington, D.C., in the nation's capital. He introduced a bill to do so, and that would have compensated slave owners for the emancipation of for the freeing of blacks. But again, there was insufficient support for that bill, and it did not pass. He spoke out against the slave trade, and he was especially a harsh critic of the slave markets in Washington, D.C. If you can imagine, in the nation's capital, he called it a stain on the nation's capital. Now, that may not sound like very harsh criticism, but for the time, that was pretty brutal criticism of the practice. So in let's see. He was. I'm losing track of his thing here. Okay, so in 1849, Lincoln left Congress, and he returned to Springfield and his law practice, and then he basically practiced law for the next almost 10 years. He actually was fairly successful as a lawyer. He represented a lot of railroads, which were expanding tremendously at the time. and across the country. So he was kind of like what we would call a corporate lawyer today. In 1950, I'm sorry, in 1858, not 1958, in 1858, Lincoln gained national attention as the Republican candidate for Senate in Illinois. He ran against Stephen Douglas, who was the Democratic candidate. And they did a series of debates uh, in order to explain to the people in Illinois their positions and why, each one thought he should be elected. So Douglas, the Democrat, promoted preserving the Union, interestingly enough. So he was, at least he claimed he was a moderate Democrat. He also, he was in favor of each state deciding whether it would allow slavery within its borders. And he was a pretty notorious white supremacist. Now, we tend to think of the South as being the seat of white supremacy. That is not exactly correct. Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, these northern Midwestern states were as in many cases virulently nativist and white supremacist as any state in the South. And indeed, the American Nazi Party was a very big element in those same three states moving into the 20th century. So Lincoln, who also, of course, was in favor of preserving the Union, he argued against the expansion of slavery into new territories. He also emphasized the moral evil of slavery, and he advocated for basic rights for Black people as well as free labor. So Lincoln was very much an advocate of the idea that there should not be slavery, and indeed, each individual should be allowed to sell his labor for, to do whatever he wanted for whatever price he was willing to, willing to take. Now, this is sort of a precursor to the what was a long time. Uh, I'm losing the word, but the Republicans historically were anti-union because they felt that unions restricted the ability of an individual to sell his labor freely. Now we've seen in the last election a little bit of a shift there. With President Trump and Vice President Vance, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, and if that really is the harbinger of some kind of realignment. But historically, Republicans were in favor of free labor. So although Lincoln lost the Senate race, his Senate race, the debates really made him a rising star within the Republican Party. So not unlike Ronald Reagan in that respect, and I don't think I've ever talked about Ronald Reagan, or if I have, not that much. So prior to running for governor of the United States, Ronald Reagan was a spokesman for GE, and he traveled all around the country talking to people about progress and the kind of things that American industry, in particular GE, could do to benefit Americans. And this sort of this years of speaking to people and for people and talking about their what benefits people could expect, I think really gave Ronald Reagan the ability as a politician to do the same thing. Reagan, as you may know, was called the Great Communicator. So in the same way, although not focused on the same subject, because the Lincoln-Douglas debates were focused on political issues, the debates really honed Lincoln's ability to speak to people about the issues of the day. And they also gave him an opportunity to really hone his arguments, especially his anti-slavery arguments. So, and now we come to the part of Lincoln's career that most of us know about. So he was elected the 16th president. 16th? Wait a minute. Yeah, 16th president. I'm pretty sure 16th president of the United States in 1960. Now, interestingly enough, he won only 40% of the popular vote, but he won the Electoral College, and that's as we've seen, that's what matters. And his election triggered the secession of the South from the Union, and led to the Civil War. So Lincoln was inaugurated as president on March 4th, 1961. Back then, inauguration took place in March, whereas today it's in January 20th, if memory serves. So the for all intents and purposes, the country was already engaged in a civil war. And he faced the immediate challenges of not only forming his own government, which was a much more difficult task back then, because this was before civil service, and so there were thousands of positions that Lincoln needed to fill by appointment, but also had to essentially direct the North's efforts during the Civil War. So on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed slaves in the, I believe the Emancipation Declaration actually says, in the states under rebellion against the United States, right? The Confederate States. But now it was somewhat controversial in its time. There were those that argued that Lincoln did not have the authority to do so. Lincoln's position was these states are under rebellion, and since they're under rebellion, I have essentially martial law authority, and that's why I can issue an Emancipation Proclamation for the states that are in rebellion. Now, a lot of people have said, see, this shows that he wasn't truly anti-slavery, because he let slavery persist in the border states, Tennessee, etc., and in areas in the North where it existed. The reality is that Lincoln almost for sure did not have the authority to ban slavery throughout the country. That would take a constitutional amendment. And with respect to the border states, where were they in rebellion or not in rebellion, that was somewhat of a debatable question. But he also needed to he wanted to keep them essentially in the Union and not further strengthen the Confederacy. And so rather than risk expanding the conflict and making the situation worse, Lincoln took the position that since the border states were not in active rebellion against the United States, he didn't have the authority to emancipate slaves there either. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation is, of course, where Lincoln's name as the Great Emancipator comes from. So, among his other accomplishments as president was he promoted the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which would permanently abolish slavery. He also, of course, sought to unify the northern states and prosecute the Union's war effort. To that end, he had minimally very bad luck with his the men he initially chose to lead the Union forces, McClellan and others. Finally, he hit upon Ulysses S. Grant, and he made him commander over the Union Army. This was a controversial move. Many thought that Grant was a drunkard and unfit to command the Union Army. And Lincoln's response, because Grant was winning victories, was, please tell me what it is that Grant is drinking so I can send a case of it to my other generals. So among Lincoln's greatest traits was he did have a wonderful sense of humor. So Lincoln was reelected to the presidency in 1864 during the Civil War, despite all of the, the war was not going particularly well. Even as late as 1864, although things were starting to turn around once Ulysses S. Grant took over. And there were Democrats in the North, of course, who were absolutely opposed to Lincoln as president, but he was reelected. Other things that he did, just moving away from the Civil War and slavery theme for a minute, was he supported the creation of the National Banking Act in 1863 that established a uniform currency. This was something that had bedeviled commerce in the United States for decades. He created the Homestead Act in 1862 that provided 160 acres of land to settlers willing to farm it for 5 years. He pushed for the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, which would connect the eastern and western United States in the event that it was not completed until after he was killed. And he advocated for land grant colleges with the Morrill Act, which essentially provided federal lands to state universities to promote higher education. And in fact, many of the early state colleges and universities were known as land grant colleges. Many of them focused on training teachers and on farming and agricultural knowledge, which were very important to the country at that time. So, and as well, he really advocated for post-war reconciliation and reconstruction and the healing of sectional divisions. His most notable speech, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, was the Gettysburg Address that he delivered on November 19th, 1863, where he mourned the loss of tens of thousands of soldiers in what was an extraordinarily bloody battle of the Civil War. And in the Gettysburg Address, if you remember it at all, he really redefined the Civil War as a fight for equality and democracy. It really evinced his deeply held belief in democracy and the idea that the government should be of the people, by the people, and for the people. Those are the famous words of the Gettysburg Address. On April 14th, 1865, while he and his wife were attending a performance at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, an actor himself, and he felt Lincoln was a tyrant because, among other things, Lincoln had suspended the writ of habeas corpus and other things. Lincoln did not die immediately, but he was taken across the street to a rooming house where he did die not too long after that. So he was 54 years old. 56 years old when he died, and his assassination absolutely shocked the country. Many Americans, especially Black Americans, deeply mourned the murder of Abraham Lincoln. And his legacy lives on today, right? We are celebrating his birthday today in recognition of his greatness as a president and a leader, as someone who maintained the Union, the United States, as one nation, as well as a man who advocated against the moral evil of slavery, and did the best he could in terms of freeing Black people in the United States, and setting them on the road to dignified, successful lives. He didn't live to see that, of course, but I think that there's no doubt that Lincoln was a seminal figure in the emancipation of slaves, and one can imagine that, looking down from heaven, Lincoln was gratified to see someone he knew well. He invited him to the White House: Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, other great leaders. Take in hand their former slaves who were now free Americans, and continue the struggle for equality and equal treatment under the law. So I'm going to read, as I mentioned, Lincoln's second inaugural address. I think I've shown you this book before, The American Reader, Words That Moved a Nation, edited by Diane Ravitch. If you love this country, this is a must-have book. It has so many of the great speeches and poems and writings about our nation. It is truly an inspirational book to read. And I'm going to read again Lincoln's second inaugural address. You won't recognize, I suspect, the first part of it, but the last part of it, I suspect you will have heard before. At this second appearing to take the oath of the presidential office, there is less occasion for an extended address than there was at the first. Then a statement somewhat in detail of a course to be pursued seemed fitting and proper. Now, at the expiration of 4 years, during which public declarations have been constantly called forth on every point and phase of the great contest, which still absorbs the attention and engrosses the energies of the nation, little that is new could be presented. The progress of our arms, upon which all else chiefly depends, is as well known to the public as to myself, and it is, I trust, reasonably satisfactory and encouraging to all. With high hope for the future, no prediction in regard to it is ventured. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it. All sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish, and the war came. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union, even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with, or even before the conflict itself should cease. Each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Both read the same Bible and both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any man should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. But let us judge not, that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled up by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. So I think we can see from this speech that Lincoln was committed to seeing the Civil War through, as much as he deplored the destruction, the death that it was causing. And he was determined to see slavery end. And in the end, for his morals and for his commitment, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. And so I hope that today you will take a few moments to think about Abraham Lincoln, his legacy, the changes that have happened in this country over the 160 years since the end of the Civil War. Think about the work still to be done. and honor Abraham Lincoln for the great president and the great man that he was. So I thank you very much for joining me today on this Abraham Lincoln's birthday celebration. I wish you a meaningful and wonderful rest of the day. And signing off as I always do, Marie, darling, you are my belle. Courage at all times, my friends.